national conversation about public safety and racism, but we need action. We need to change the scenario that exists in so many places where public safety departments have seen one group of citizens in a community as their clients and another group of citizens as the threat, which leads to systemic racism, differences in approach depending on the color of the skin of the person that you're dealing with. Maybe as simple as saying, let's stop that person, they have dark skin and they're driving through this neighborhood and maybe they don't belong here. Or let's stop that person because they have dark skin and maybe they're dealing drugs. Systemic racism and profiling. And a discussion about what is the value that we should aim for here in America. And that value is that every member of the community is a client, that there is the goal of providing equal public safety services to all, and treating each and every person the same, regardless of the color of their skin. To have each public safety officer say, how would I respond differently if I saw 3 young teenagers running towards a house and they're black rather than white? And taking that into account and saying, we're going to change that. We're going to respond the same. They're all our clients. They're all our clients. We're here to serve everyone. So that's the national discussion. And people coming into the streets and protesting, a group of African American, Black American protesters in Oregon, one of them wearing a t-shirt saying, we march, we sit down, we speak up, we die. I was thinking when I read that about the experience I had a number of years ago when a Black American was working with me rebuilding a house, helping me out for a few weeks. And we went out in suburban Maryland, this is back in the 1980s, and we were trying to find a particular part or piece of equipment, and we didn't know where that specialty store was, and we pulled up next to a sheriff. And the sheriff's car had 2 white sheriffs in it with a shotgun propped up between the seats. And I said to my friend, hey, roll down your window and ask those sheriffs where this place is. And he started to roll down the window and he looked over and he saw the 2 white sheriffs with the gun between them. And he never said a word. He just turned back. He looked straight ahead and he looked terrified. I saw those sheriffs as people who worked for me, who should work for everyone, that we could ask them for their help. He saw them as someone, if he started a dialogue with them, he might end up in deep trouble, in physical harm. That's what this conversation is about. That's what we're seeking to change in America. And this idea of protesting for change, this is as American as apple pie. This is as American as the American Revolution, of people standing up and saying, this is not right. Freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, core values of what it means to be a we the people republic. Well, these protesters, often African American, often of many races, have been coming together, and there have been some folks, often younger folks, who have come to cause a bit of trouble that goes beyond simple protesting. And we've had a challenge in Portland of white extremists, often dressing in camouflage, Antifa members who are looking for a fight, conflicting, often late at night. And Portland has worked very hard to de-escalate that situation, to de-escalate it, to empower the message that the protesters are bringing about restructuring systemic racism, ending systemic racism. And these acts, these conflicts, take away from that message. But as they worked so hard to de-escalate, along came President Trump. And Trump had a different objective. He wanted to escalate violence on the streets of Portland. And I can tell you there's a huge difference between protesting and making your message known and respecting that, having a government that respects it. It's our government, it's our we the people government, and a government, an executive in the Oval Office who deploys federal forces to create chaos and violence and to attack peaceful protesters. I've come to the floor twice in the last 2 days to go through and show the camouflaged, battle-ready troops deployed by Trump who are coming in a secret fashion, eliminating any indication of who they work for. Are they Customs and Border Protection? Are they Federal Protective Service? Are U.S. Marshals? No identity, and have stripped all their unique identifiers, which means they can club a peaceful protester, they can shoot him in the head, and nobody knows who did it because there's no ID on their uniform. No accountability and no discipline, and outrageous attacks on peaceful protesters. When I was here speaking yesterday and I asked for consideration be given on this floor for my amendment to end secret policing, very simple amendment says you wear identification of your agency, you wear a unique identifier, and you don't go outside your mission of protecting a federal building unless you're in partnership with a governor or a mayor. That's simple. So simple. But my Republican colleague came down and objected to consideration of this amendment. And I think, in essence, he didn't believe the story that I'm presenting. The story I'm telling you about peaceful protesters being attacked. Maybe because it's so outside the conception of what a president would do that it's just hard to acknowledge that we have a president who embraces this secret police strategy of assaulting peaceful protesters, grabbing people out of the crowd, throwing them into unmarked vans. It is hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine a president of the United States admiring authoritarian dictators across the planet. But we have a president who admires the authoritarian dictator-style tactics of Duterte in the Philippines, who admires the crown prince who assassinated and dismembered an American-based reporter for the Washington Post. We have a president who admires Putin, who crushes the civil rights of his people. We have a president who admires the strong-arm tactics Erdogan is employing in Turkey. That's what we have, but until now, he didn't bring the secret police to the streets of America. But now he has. I'm going to try a different way of conveying what's going on and do it in the voices of women who were there at the protest 2 nights ago to try to convey what is happening on the streets of Portland and how terribly, terribly wrong that is. This message, all mothers were summoned when he called out to his mama. It's a reference to George Floyd dying with a policeman's knee on his neck, cutting off either his air or his carotid artery, blood supply to his brain, or both, killing him. So mamas have responded. They said, let's go join the protests as well. Surely this is not the case that they're attacking peaceful protesters. So they formed a group that went down and they did things like dancing and chanting and handing out flowers, like this woman here. Isn't she beautiful? She's coming down holding a sunflower, others were holding mums. It's unimaginable that a president of the United States would send federal troops to attack women like this, holding peaceful flowers, dancing and singing in the streets. But they were scared because they knew that peaceful protesters had been attacked previously, and so some of them wore goggles, some of them wore bike helmets. But let's hear from the women in their own words. Two of these women work on my team. I didn't know that they were going to go down. I didn't know until last night that they had gone down the previous night, that they had been there, that they had experiences. And they chose to share their experiences, and I have maybe another 5 or 6 things that women wrote up about their experiences and posted them. So I'll try to share those, reading it in their voice. The first one is from Stacy Jochimson. I joined the Wall of Moms in Portland on Tuesday night to support Black and brown Americans and voice my concerns about police violence in our city. I showed up in cutoff shorts and a yellow shirt, the identifier for the Portland Wall of Moms. I was wearing sneakers and carrying yellow mums and sunflowers that other moms had gifted me on my way in. We participated in hours of dancing, chanting, singing. It was a beautiful protest on a warm Oregon night. I saw no violence. I felt safe. We were demanding change. We were standing up for our Black and brown brothers and sisters. We were there to amplify their voices. Was there graffiti? Yes, sure there was. Graffiti is not violence. Around 11 p.m., the Wall of Moms was called to the front of the federal courthouse. We went, we stood, arms linked, facing the building, creating a wall of protection between the protesters and the building. We were moms called to use our privilege to keep others safe, and we tried. While we stood, arms linked, officers in fatigues and gas masks, we assume were federal, they were unidentified, rushed from the building and from behind us. There was no warning. They took a woman to the ground and hogtied her on the steps of the courthouse. They swiped at cell phones and yelled at us behind gas masks. They pointed weapons at us. We were nonviolent, peaceful demonstrators. We were moms in Converse sneakers holding flowers. I am still trembling at the sight of their weapons pointed at us. I have never felt so threatened and unsafe as I did at that moment. I had the realization that these officers really are not here to protect, they are here to harm. Were we going to be shot? Would I be struck in the head by a canister? Am I going to make it home to my children? We held our line as they threw flashbangs and shot gas canisters at us. I was peaceful. I was standing still and holding hands with women around me. Surely they would not shoot at me. I could feel the women on both sides of me trembling. The officers pointed their weapons at us. I put my hands in the air and begged them not to hurt us. They shot more tear gas. The tear gas overwhelmed us. The pain was unimaginable. It burned my eyes, my throat, my skin. I did not bring goggles or a helmet to this protest. I wore a tank top and shorts. Why would I need a helmet and goggles at this peaceful protest? I coughed to the point of vomiting. We ran. Fellow protesters came to us with water bottles and helped clean our eyes. Another brought wipes to clean our skin. We coughed, we vomited, we cried. Today, I am still shaking. I cannot focus. I am scared. I am jumping at loud noises. My heart is racing simply recalling the events of last night. I am worried about what the federal officers are going to do to my fellow Oregonians tonight. Let me be clear. There was violence on Tuesday night, but none of it was from the protesters. The only violence I encountered that night was from the federal police officers. I am grateful that I made it home to my kids last night. Others were not so fortunate. Thank you, Stacy, for sharing your firsthand account of the night before last, Tuesday nights on the streets of Portland, when federal officers attacked peaceful demonstrators where there was no violence except the violence of the officers on the protesters. This next recounting is from Amy Bacher. She writes, pre-protest normalcy. There are people hanging out in a downtown park by the Justice Center. They're wearing masks, playing music, and thanks to Riot Ribs, eating free food. The Wall of Moms gathers a short distance from there, where they hand out sunflowers and yellow carnations. Protective gear is also distributed, like helmets, due to issues with the federal police firing ammunition. Medics hand out water and other safety gear to everyone to try to keep protesters safe. Usually, about a few hours into the protests, the secret police come out. It's unclear who they are now because there are no markings for what unit, who they're with. And they fire at the protesters. When it was Portland Public Bureau, Police Bureau, they were allowed to have their badges covered. My experience yesterday included the following. About 2,000 people gathered, chanted, gave speeches, and danced in the blocks in front of the Justice Center and Federal Building in the name of Black Lives Matter. People were serious about wearing masks. A small white plane circled the protest area repeatedly. It appeared to be a same or similar aircraft to the plane that circled earlier protests around Revolution Hall. There were a few protesters trying to block a door of the Federal Building and post graffiti. One of the chants we shouted in front of the Federal Building was, "Tell me what democracy looks like." Then, "This is what democracy looks like." We were all using our voices. The next moment, though, about 15 to 20 large men in camouflage and military gear appeared, like they were ready for war. They had no name tags or identifiers. We had no idea if they were soldiers, what branch they were from, or why they were there. Almost all of them were holding pepper spray guns and looked like they had customized sidearms. They stood under the eaves of the Federal Building. The Wall of Moms were there in yellow t-shirts, stretch pants, and sneakers, basically. There was a long line, more than a block long, facing the Federal Building. We were trying to stand in front of all the other protesters who had already been gassed for some 50-plus days, thinking that Trump's military would not fire on moms. We were wrong. There was no ask by officers in front of us to step back, move, or do anything at all. The officers started kicking tear gas directly at us, shoving a nearby mom in the neck, and pepper spraying another mom in the face at close range. I had not been tear gassed before and can't believe that it's allowed, especially with such frequency. It produces violent and immediately bodily reactions and should not be used on peaceful protesters. There is a near immediate reaction. You can't see without pain of blinking. It feels like you're inhaling fire into your lungs and like your skin is being burnt. My lungs are still burning 24 hours later. These are weapons of war that should not be used on Portlanders exercising their constitutional right to freedom or assembly. If after 54 days, officers are still using these weapons of war and it's not working, we should be asking why. Why they are still deemed effective or legal. Just before the first tear gas was thrown, 3 to 4 of the other officers tackled a woman to the ground and hogtied her. We didn't see where she was taken. At least 4 women were arrested from that group. And then she gives a reference to the story on the web and how to find it. Also notes that federal agents pepper sprayed the first aid tent, which could be a crime when done in war. Federal agents went by the Riot Ribs free food cart in the park and slashed water bottles and pepper sprayed the food and the grills. And that's where she ends her commentary. Thank you very much, Amy, for sharing your story of what happened the night before last. I hope that all of America is recognizing that what we would never conceive to happen in America is happening. Federal agents, federal officers deployed to attack peaceful protests. As these two women pointed out, there was graffiti, but it wasn't violent. In one of the other letters I'm about to read, they note that there were young folks pounding on the plywood that covers the doors of the federal building, but that too wasn't violent. The only violence came from the federal officers. This next story was posted by Krista. She writes, "So the nonviolent Walla moms just got gassed for absolutely no reason." And then she puts in the tags, PDX protest and Black Lives Matter. I don't need cookies for being there, please. I have the privilege of taking a night off to let my lungs rest. Black and brown people don't get to change their skin color to take a break from systemic and personal racism. Also, black women have been on the front lines for decades. The Walla Moms is getting a lot of attention, but we're not the story. Abolishing racist systems and ending police brutality against people of color is the real story. If you want to get involved but aren't able to go downtown, please consider making a donation to Don't Shoot Portland. Honestly, the leaf blowers helped so much on Monday. I was wishing the dads had come out in force again Tuesday because the moms got gassed bad. It was brutal. I'm still coughing and burning 4 hours later. Come on, dads. Until we have meaningful change, the protests will continue. Don't give up yet. And Krista makes a point that I want to accentuate time and time again. Black Americans have been protesting, putting their lives at risk, night after night after night. All kinds of protesters coming together, all kinds of skin color coming together in order to say Black Lives Matter and we have to end systemic racism. Madam President, my colleague is here to speak, and can I reserve the balance of my time under the hour? I ask unanimous consent to reserve the balance of my time under the hour and yield to my colleague.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I want to thank my colleague from Oregon for his eloquence, the power of his remarks. He speaks not only for Oregon, he speaks for America. He speaks for every one of our communities and states that ought to fear this overreach. It was indeed one of the main fears of our founding fathers that the misuse and abuse of our military and policing power, violating fundamental rights, would encroach on our basic liberties. Now, let's be very real. Federal forces have been used before to restore order in the face of violence. After the Rodney King incident, after the killing of Martin Luther King in 1968, Little Rock in 1957, Oxford, Mississippi, 1962, and going further back in our history, the Pullman strike, the Detroit race riots in 1943. But this time is different. This time is fundamentally different. As my colleague has so powerfully described, from the descriptions and the photographs that he has brought to the Senate floor. What we have here is not some violent encroachment by one group against another, not some use of violence. We have peaceful protests. And in fact, the purpose and effect of the use of federal forces here has been to incite and fuel violence. It was the same purpose that Richard Nixon sought to use federal force when protesters against the Vietnam War came to Washington. It was Richard Nixon who said that law and order was the political issue of his day. But the use of federal forces here is not to restore order or enforce the law. It is instead to incite lawbreaking and violence. What is different also is the use of unidentified military-like forces. We've seen a growth over the past years in the forms of such forces that are available to the president to use. The Customs and Border Patrol, the Department of Transportation, other agencies have militarized federal law enforcement agents. They have put them in camouflage. They have given them armament. They have taught them tactics that, in effect, turn them into military-style forces. They have become a secret police when they are unidentified. They are like the little green men in Russia that show up at demonstrations and throw people into vans to disappear them. That's what they've been doing in Oregon. And so, whereas before the National Guard might have been called out as a show of force to restore order, now we have a perniciously different use of military force in the name of law enforcement. And I will say, as someone whose career as a United States attorney and then as Attorney General for 20 years was involved in law enforcement, I am ashamed and embarrassed by using, in effect, a secret police in this way, supposedly in the name of law enforcement, but in reality as a political tool. And if you have any doubt about the political purposes here, just watch the latest Trump ads, which are the other side of this coin. Raising fear, exhorting people to panic, and then responding on the streets in communities with this excessive use of force. Exactly what our founding fathers feared was this unchecked use of military power. And that is why the bill that my colleague from Oregon has introduced and that I have co-sponsored is so very important, because there must be a check. Accountability is vital. Identification is key. People need to know who these law enforcement supposedly are. And we need accountability from them, and we need accountability also through the Insurrection Act. I've offered a bill, joined by many of my colleagues, the Civil Act, that would apply the same checks on the president's power as apply when the president uses military abroad. He must be accountable to Congress. He must come to Congress and explain the purposes and the reasons for his use of military power. He should have no more leeway when he uses troops abroad than he would at home, and vice versa. If he uses American troops against American citizens, he ought to be accountable no less than when he uses them abroad. And the same is true of these policing powers. The importance of this moment cannot be underestimated. It is a moment of reckoning for racial justice, but for justice in our entire country. And I believe that we must act on both sides of the aisle. We have an obligation to assure that this power is checked, because those police forces are coming to your city and your community, to Albuquerque and Chicago, and potentially to Hartford and Stamford and New Haven in Connecticut, without the permission or invitation of our local officials. Again, a fundamental difference between many past uses of political power and this one. And it may be rationalized or disguised as an effort to combat violence in the streets, but we know the purpose and intent and effect of the use of these policing forces. So whether they are the Department of Justice or Homeland Security or Department of Transportation or the Secret Service, the goal is the same: to intimidate and incite, not to restore order. The shame and disgrace to this nation is palpable. When our allies, when peoples abroad look to the United States, they see us as an exception to the rule of force unchecked by the rule of law. Too often, force, not law, applies to subjugate rights. We are an exceptional nation because we believe in the rule of law. But what we are seeing right now is a corruption of the rule of law. In fact, using the disguise and misusing the name of law and order to push forward an agenda of hatred and bias and subjugation of basic rights. It is a shameful and tragic time for America. My hope is Americans will rise up, that they will object with their voices and ultimately with their votes. I thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor back to my colleague from Oregon.
Senator from Oregon.
I thank my colleague from Connecticut for bringing his experience in the legal world to bear on this extraordinary development of secret police being deployed on the streets of America. As we heard from the president, he wants to expand this model. It was first in DC, then it's Portland, now he's talking about Philadelphia and Baltimore and Chicago and Detroit, Oakland. In other words, all across America, as the president says, where there happen to be Democratic mayors. He wants to go create that same mayhem. Thank you for bringing your expertise to bear on this. I had just read the story from Krista about the moms and the protesters all getting, as she put it, gassed bad. She said it was brutal, coughing and burning 4 hours later. And she closed with, "Come on, dads, we have to have meaningful change. Don't give up." And I was thinking about what I'm describing as I read these stories, or what these women are describing, is the transition from this setting where women are dancing, they're holding flowers, they're singing, they're chanting, they're eating ribs, and what unfolded a few moments later. And what unfolded? Two of these stories so far have described the sudden appearance of large men in camouflage, armed with sidearms, who shortly started to shoot them, gas them, spray them, throw flashbang grenades, tackle them, in one case hogtie a woman who was a few feet away. And you can see how terrifying. These are men dressed for war against women dancing and holding flowers. This is beyond wrong. This is inconceivable. These unmarked, no agency, no unique identifier, secret police, what my colleague just referred to like the little green men in Russia, coming to sweep people off the streets and throw them into unmarked vans. These pictures, I understand, are from 2 nights ago, and people were described to me how batons were brought down, one on the neck of a woman, how they were thrown to the ground. This is showing maybe some of that right there. I can't imagine how terrified this woman was. And think about this. Within this week, where we're recognizing John Lewis passing away, here's John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge being beaten by so-called public safety officers. I think they were Alabama police, but I'm not sure who they were. They have badges. At least they weren't secret police. And this scene from 2 nights ago in Portland, these women being assaulted by these men ready for war with every armament you can think about, including impact projectiles, that is, rubber bullets and gas and flashbang grenades and batons, assaulting these women dressed in yellow t-shirts. I want to stress, as this last letter did, that for weeks and weeks and weeks before there was a wall of moms, protesters of every race were coming down to say we must reform systemic racism in America. And they too were peacefully protesting, and they too were standing, often with arms linked. The outrage over the federal troops being deployed with these secret police tactics have swelled the numbers, including this most recent protest. But let's not think for a moment there haven't been people of great courage week after week, many of them organized and led by the black population, black leaders of Portland. How is it possible? Edmund Pettus Bridge, where a little over a year ago I was standing with my daughter and John Lewis, remembering what happened back when out-of-control leaders sent well-armed men to brutally assault peaceful protesters. And now, once again, we have out-of-control men, the President of the United States, sending well-armed men to brutally beat peaceful protesters. How is this conceivable? Protesters of all kinds have been working hard to basically say, let's have public safety that works for all. But what is the president doing? While he's sending these forces to brutally beat peaceful protesters, he's running campaign ads. And here it is: you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America, paid for by Donald J. Trump for president. He's deliberately assaulting peaceful protesters in order to run campaign commercials that says he's a strong man that can reduce violence in America. Let us all beware how twisted this is, how evil this is, how wrong this is, how much of an assault on the civil liberties of Americans this is, and how much we have a responsibility, having taken an oath to the Constitution, to put an end to it. Which is why I'm down here for the 3rd day in a row saying, let's insist that federal officers be identified by who they represent, the agency. Let's insist federal officers have a unique identifier. Let's insist that if their mission is to protect the federal building, they're on the perimeter of the federal building, not sweeping through the streets of Portland, throwing people into unmarked vans. That's my amendment. That's the amendment I'm asking to be considered on this floor. Isn't our responsibility to debate when egregious things happen in America, like a strongman authoritarian president trampling on the Constitution by assaulting peaceful protesters with federal forces? Isn't it our responsibility to debate it and vote on whether secret police are allowed in the United States of America? I've been reading these letters from the women who were down there. I'll read one or two more, and then I'm going to yield to my colleague from Oregon. As the two senators from Oregon, we have heard from hundreds of people who've been protesting peacefully over these weeks, and how hard local leaders have worked to de-escalate, and how Trump sending in these federal forces to beat protesters, peaceful protesters, has completely escalated the situation rather than de-escalating it. All so that Donald Trump can run a campaign commercial and try to persuade you he should be president. This story is written, this recounting is written by Joy. She says, and she was down there with Krista, so she starts out, I don't know how my friend Krista managed to take a picture during the madness of this moment. I could not see anything and was struggling to breathe through the mass of foamy snot provoked by the tear gas that filled my mask. And she had posted a picture that Krista had taken of her right after she had been gassed. I don't think I have do I have the picture? I might have. Let me see if we can, no. If I find it, I'll put it up. Getting gas was painful and scary, yet I still felt secure and cared for by the several helpers that aided us with water and saline eye washes. Several people checked in to see if we were okay and help. That is the beautiful part of this otherwise unpleasant image. This is me on my knees, being helped by strangers. The ugly part of this moment is what happened before this. The moment when federal agents blasted us with tear gas and rubber bullets, despite zero provocation. We were simply standing side by side with linked arms. That's it. For no apparent reason, they shot at a bunch of moms without giving a single warning. Nope, no warning, no request to move. They just blasted away at us like they were playing a video game. I yield to my colleague from Oregon and reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. President,
The senator from Oregon.
I want to thank my colleague for putting a human face, the face of Oregonians, on this federal invasion of our state. And I want to talk just for a moment and ask my colleague a question, because yesterday here in Washington, as our constituents were finding this horrific invasion of their constitutional rights, the moms and others, when they were peacefully protesting, what we saw in the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Merkley, was an example of just how disconnected the Trump administration is from reality as they try to find these fig leaves to cover up for their violation of the constitutional rights of our citizens. We had a nominee for a top legal position in the Trump administration, a top position, legal position, that is greatly going to affect the constitutional rights of the people we are honored to represent, the rights that are now being violated, as we have said repeatedly here on the floor. The nominee's name was Patrick Hovakimian, and I asked him a couple of basic questions that our constituents are asking. I asked him, do you believe that federal forces can patrol American cities over the objections of state and local officials and away from federal buildings. That's something you and I get asked all the time by our constituents. Then I also asked him, do you believe that unidentified federal forces in unmarked cars can drive around seizing and detaining American citizens? Also something we're very familiar with, and I pointed out, American troops are soldiers who so courageously fight the terrorists. Clear identification with them. And again, he just ducked and bobbed and weaved. And at one point, and then he repeated it, he said, Senator, just give my best wishes to the people of Portland. And so I asked for, again, a responsive answer, and he wished us best wishes again. These people that are getting gassed, like Sharon Myron, that you and I have talked about, personal friend of our family in emergency room, Doc, getting gassed with a tear gas canister when there's no provocation. That's the position of the Trump administration, sending best wishes to the people you and I represent. And so it seems to me, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, because you've spent a lot of time thinking through where this is headed, because we were kind of the test tube. We were the people that were going to be first. But the president has said he's going on to other cities. Both of us share a great interest in healthcare. I sure as hell wish that he would attack the coronavirus with half of the intensity that he's attacked our city. We're going to talk some more about that. But let me get your reaction to what I think is the central question. And I really pondered this as we were listening to these non-answers yesterday by a top Trump official. By the way, he's in a top position now in the Justice Department to know about these legal issues that reflect the violations of the constitutional rights of our constituents, and then get a bigger job, a bigger role in these issues. And I thought to myself, it seems to me, without drawing a line in the sand, America may be looking down the barrel of martial law in the middle of a presidential election. I'd be interested in the thoughts of my colleague, because I've been amazed at the number of senators who've come up and said, Ron, that really seems to me what it's come down to. But my colleague is a student of history and has brought so much specific documentation, like the cases that you've been spelling out. I'd be interested in my colleague's assessment of where he thinks this is going.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Thank you for asking my thoughts on this. Just before you spoke, I had described the story of Joy, who talked about a picture that her friend Krista had taken during the chaos just after she'd been gassed. And I did check, and here is the picture of her. You can see her whole face is inflamed. So many people, they can't see, they're dazed, their lungs are on fire. And Patrick Ovakimian, if I have his name right, is sending best wishes to the people of Oregon. It reminds me of a cartoon I saw when I was young, in which Lucy goes out after it's observed how cold Snoopy is out shivering on top of during a snowstorm, and He's shivering on top of his doghouse, and Lucy goes out and says, hope you stay warm, and goes back in her house. Yeah, best wishes, but I'm not doing a thing to help you out. I would love for Mr. Avakimian to say, I'll come and stand there, I'll see what's really going on, and if peaceful protesters are being attacked, that is simply unacceptable. And as a leader, I will take it to President Trump and tell President Trump, we don't do secret police in America. We don't sweep people into vans. And if you really want me to take this position, that's what I'm going to change the policy to, because that's what you do in a republic. We are not a dictatorship. That's what I'd like to hear him say in response to your question to him. You asked martial law, secret police operating as rogue operators outside framework of law, outside cooperation with the governor or the mayor, sounds like the equivalent of martial law to me.
Madam President, how much additional time does my colleague have? No, I understand that. I'm just trying to...
The junior senator from Oregon has 26 minutes post-cloture remaining.
Very good.
Thank you for my colleague for the intense, Madam President.
The senator from Oregon.
Thank you to my colleague from Oregon for his intense representation of these legal issues and role on the Intelligence Committee, and noting that this has all the trappings of a president bent on the equivalent of martial law, operating in this just rogue fashion, shredding the constitutional rights of people, sending federal officers to attack peaceful protesters. I was reading the stories of women who were down at the protest the night before last. The next one is from Stephanie. She says, I went downtown again last night to peacefully protest, to use my voice and my First Amendment rights, to feel safe, repeat, to feel safe against these anonymous federal agents. I wore a bike helmet, goggles, a double mask, earplugs, and I was still terrified. The wall of moms stood locked, arm in arm, right up against the fence line at the federal courthouse. We stood between these federal agents dressed in war gear and unarmed protesters shouting behind us. Sweat poured down my back. The mom stood for hours. On my bike ride home, I texted an individual, Jeff, not me. Each time I stopped, I called Amy to have a buddy on the phone with me. Every time I heard a car, my heart skipped a beat. Is it a crew of federal kidnappers ready to throw me into a van? This administration has been chipping away at our rights since day one, but this past week in Portland has been an acceleration. Wake up, especially those supporting them. We are in a crisis of great magnitude, and we are about to lose control. Candace Jimenez, member of the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, said she came out to protest after the deployment of federal agents and said, we have been dealing with that for 500 years. We understand the trauma, the terrorism, and the harm it causes. Bev writes, in less than 8 hours, a group of moms helped me put together this wall of moms. We tried in earnest to give the kids a break by shifting the pervasive narrative that protesters are rioters. Case in point, we wore our whites to show we weren't there to make trouble. We showed up to prove the feds or the violent ones, and we were right. Kids took down fences and did some skateboarding. 2 or 3 kids banged on walls, but the other people were peaceful. I want to tell you that I didn't vomit or pee my pants after being gassed, but I did. I guess I lost control, and soon after I couldn't open my eyes. To be clear, we moms weren't armed. We weren't throwing rocks. We weren't throwing water. That didn't happen. We were gassed for chanting, "Leave the kids alone." I want you to think about what's happening in this country and ask yourself how you're going to help change it. Heather was down at the protest, and I don't have her picture, her larger picture, but I can tell you that she posted a picture. She's very pregnant, and how gutsy I think that is, that she's there even as she's about to give birth. And she writes, "I am 9 months pregnant, and I stood between the police and the rest of the protesters last night with about 40 other moms. My unborn baby is the topic of many Twitter debates right now and symbolizes a 1,000-year-old debate among those who want to stifle women's freedom. Right now, I have even more power than usual, and I am here to use it. I am safe. Thanks, everybody, for your concern. But we are not okay. Until all women can carry a pregnancy to term and birth without worrying about unnecessary trauma and death, we are not okay. I show up for all the pregnant women who have lost their babies or their lives at the hands of racist and sexist systems and people. I show up for the women who have had a hard time getting pregnant because of the everyday stress caused by racism. I march for all the black mothers who rightfully agonize about their children's safety outside their homes. I march for anyone who's been injured physically or mentally by police brutality, citizen brutality, systemic inequity, intergenerational trauma, and poverty. And I march for the white people finally waking up. See me and get me. Get out, pay up, and listen. I march for all of us because this is a problem for all of us. When you say all lives matter, take into account that you are doing what you are doing in your life to improve the world for all people. Are you worried about my unborn child? Please answer these questions in your hearts. Then get the hell out there and stand up for a better world for my baby and his generation. Madam President, I reserve the balance of my time and yield to my colleague from Oregon.
Madam President, how much time
Senator
does
from Oregon.
Parliamentary inquiry? How much time does my colleague from Oregon have on his hour remaining?
The junior senator from Oregon has 20 minutes remaining.
Right. Thank you. And I'll just take a few. And we're very pleased that our colleague from Illinois is here, who's been a very significant ally in this. Senator Merkley, one of the reasons that I so appreciate your taking this time is that it reminds me a bit of what Jews faced in the 1930s. My family fled the Nazis in the 1930s. Not all our family got out. My great-uncle Max, my father's great-uncle Max, was one of the last gassed in Theresienstadt. And Jewish families saw that a democratically elected government can transform into a murderous regime before the eyes of its citizens very quickly. There isn't any bright line when it happens, no cinematic moment where everything changes. Just a moment, as we talked about earlier, where bureaucrats and lawyers and police begin to follow the bidding of their leader while perverting the rules of their republic. And this hadn't been a singular event. From Europe to Asia to the Americas, democratically elected governments were undermined and replaced, as you have pointed out, by authoritarian regimes, often while retaining the trappings of democracy. Bureaucrats would always claim, as Mr. Hovakimian did yesterday in the Intelligence Committee, they always said they're following the rules, soldiers and police, just following orders, and then he just wished us best wishes. Rarely did these leaders start with majority support, but terror combined with abuse of the elections process, which we are also very concerned about as it relates to this fall, allowed them to claim power from the ballot box. And it seems to me you're laying out that it is our sacred duty to learn from this history, to bring this history to the floor. And as I tried to say with respect to the threat of martial law, to draw a bright line when a government instituted to protect liberty is being used to attack liberty. We shouldn't, we cannot, we can't wait until you have a gun at your back to raise the alarm. Government isn't going to defend itself. The same Attorney General who's taken an oath to defend the Constitution will sit idly by while citizens are detained without charge and violently assaulted by the government. The same police officer charged with defending our citizens will commit those assaults if that's, in effect, what they're directed to do. The executive in any government served by the bureaucracy rules. They will take all the power they can unless a brave judiciary and a strong legislature step up and, as you have outlined here on this floor, say no more. This Congress has been way too pliant and yielding and has emboldened the executive branch led by Donald Trump to ignore the constraints that have traditionally protected our liberty. So, my question is, it seems to me you are standing up for these kind of core values of freedom that are what we stand for as Americans, and that this has been the beacon all around the world for over a century. And I believe what you're saying, and I think it would be helpful for you to put it in your own words, is what you're saying is we have got to be out here working on your legislation, working on these key kind of measures, because without this effort, there's a real danger. On our watch, the light of liberty will fade away. And it seems to me what you're saying is we're better than this. And I would like your reaction to that, because I think if you look at the march of history, which in the Wyden household is very, very personal, to have lost, family of the Hitler's murderous, regime, I would like to hear your thoughts about this kind of challenge we face and how important the work in front of us is to make sure that light of liberty doesn't fade away.
Madam President,
The senator from Oregon.
my colleagues described how his family was affected by fascism in Germany, how his family members died for fascism, attacking them, imprisoning them, concentration camps, putting them to death. Don't we all believe that every German citizen should have stood up to that fascism and said, not here, not by our government, but by our people? And that is exactly why we're on the floor right now, to say secret police, not here, not by our government, not allowed in our republic. Sweeping people off the street into unmarked vans, not allowed, not here, not our government, and we will put an end to it. Gassing, assaulting, batoning peaceful protesters on the streets of our city, not here, not allowed, and we will put an end to it. I yield to my colleague, who I believe wishes to speak.
The Assistant Democrat Leader.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to direct a question to the junior senator from Oregon through the chair. Madam President, I thank my colleagues, both my colleagues from Oregon. I especially thank my colleague, Senator Merkley, who contacted me last weekend when the situation was unfolding in Portland and talked to me about his reaction to it and what he was hearing from the people of the state that he represents. And of course, there was a genuine concern in the city of Chicago, which I'm honored to represent, because this president and the White House have been taking swipes at that city for years now. And we fully anticipated that the atrocity that was occurring in Portland could occur in Chicago as well. And I just want to say to the senator from Oregon, thank you for your leadership on this. Thank you for bringing this issue to the fore and to the floor of the United States Senate. This is an issue we should be voting on. We should have voted on it this week. There was no excuse for it. We've risen to the occasion before when an historic occurrence brings it to our attention that the Senate should speak and express itself. We should have done it this week on the issue that you brought, and I hope that we can resort to this issue quickly, if not today, as quickly as possible afterwards. I am a co-sponsor of the legislation which the senator is offering, and it's basic. It is fundamental. As I recall, and I'll ask the senator from Oregon, what you're asking for is if the federal government is going to send out the so-called law enforcement protective forces and such that they identify themselves, that they not come into a community anonymously without any indication of who they are. I'm reminded of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the eastern portions of Ukraine, the Donetsk region. And the Russians, Vladimir Putin was very careful that his invaders did not wear Russian uniforms. They were known as little green men. We have a comparable situation here, where the federal forces are not identifying the agencies they represent, but coming to the streets of Portland in camouflage. The senator from Oregon, I'd like you to please, if you would, respond. Has this not been the case? Has this been documented?
To my colleague from Illinois, that is exactly right. As seen in this picture and the testimony of all those who are present, Mark Morgan, the Customs and Border Protection Commissioner, said that's not the case. And he said, our personnel are clearly marked as federal law enforcement officers and have unique identifiers. They were not. They are operating, as you say, like little green men, secret police.
I'd like to ask another question through the chair to the senator from Oregon. Is it not also true that many of these agencies, these federal agencies, have defined responsibilities, defined areas of jurisdiction? For example, in the city of Chicago, as probably is the case in Portland, Oregon, there is a federal protective service that has a specific building and facility and personnel in that facility that they're responsible for. Is that not the case in Oregon?
That is the case.
And in this situation, have these federal agents of some different agency or whatever extended their reach of jurisdiction beyond that federal protected facility?
They have.
How far?
Well, they've been present in streets. I don't know just how many blocks from the federal building, but certainly not just on the perimeter of the federal property. They have swept through streets. They have vans that have gone through the streets. They have grabbed protesters and thrown them into the vans. So they have departed significantly from, if you will, the mission of defending the federal building.
Directing another question to the senator through the chair, what has been the coordination of this federal activity with local and state law enforcement in Portland, Oregon?
Madam President, if I can request unanimous consent that our dialogue be credited to my colleagues 1 hour, because I'm afraid my minutes are run out. Unanimous consent, please.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. You asked about coordination. My understanding is that there was not an invitation from the mayor to come, that there was not a conversation with the governor. There certainly was no conversation with Senator Wyden or myself or the other members of the delegation. The Portland police have indicated that they have not worked in cooperation with these federal forces. They may have been engaged in what they call deconfliction, and I don't know the full extent of that.
Well, I don't know if I'm on my own time at this moment or I am. Fine. So I'll still continue without objection the colloquy between myself and the junior senator from Oregon. Let me say to the senator, we were concerned at the beginning of this week because of your experience with what might happen in the city of Chicago. Senator Duckworth and I sent a letter to the President of the United States expressing that concern. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the letter be entered into the record along with the press release describing its contents.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I also would like to say to the senator from Oregon that the Department of Justice made an announcement yesterday that they were in fact sending, I assume, a number of federal agents, 150, into Chicago in pursuit of an operation known as Operation Legend. This is an operation which began July 8th, 2020 by the federal government starting in Kansas City because of the death of a young man, a 4-year-old, Legend Taliaferro, shot and killed in the early morning hours in Kansas City on June 29th. I received a phone call this morning from the U.S. Attorney John Losh of the Northern District of Illinois, a man whom I was instrumental in selecting and supporting and still do support to this day, his professional activities, who gave me his personal assurance that what happened in Oregon was not going to happen in Chicago, that this Operation Legend, as he described it to me, was a coordination with state and local law enforcement in the city of Chicago and state of Illinois to make certain that their activities were coordinated and known in advance, and that they were focusing on gun violence and drug trafficking in the city of Chicago. I've also been alerted by Mayor Lori Lightfoot that she has received the same assurances and briefing, as well as the governor, J.B. Pritzker of Illinois. So our circumstances are different than the ones that Portland faced. And I will tell you that we are going to hold Mr. Losh, as well as the Department of Justice and all others, to their word that we will not see in Chicago anything like what we witnessed in the streets of Portland, Oregon. And I just want to say in closing to the senator from Oregon, thank you for bringing this to our attention, because when we were alerted, the governor, the mayor of Chicago, Senator Duckworth and I both jumped on this immediately, contacting the Trump administration for clarity about what was going to happen in Chicago. We have been given these assurances. There was a lengthy press release. I ask unanimous consent that it be entered into the record at this point.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. A lengthy press release which describes the activities that are going to take place, again, with the knowledge and coordination of local law enforcement. What happened in Portland, Oregon is unacceptable in the United States of America. We have heard the historical analogies from the senior senator from Oregon, where authoritarian central governments move into an area and take control. We have seen the historic parallel in the eastern reaches of Ukraine and in Crimea. We know what it looks like because history has shown us. We don't want this occurring in the United States of America. I am sorry for those who were injured and bear the scars of this federal incursion into the city of Portland, Oregon. I stand with the junior senator from Oregon. We will call and we will pass, I hope, on a bipartisan basis, the reassertion of the basic principles of this country when it comes to the separation of powers and when it comes to the dignity which we ask in the streets of America under our Constitution. I thank the junior senator from Oregon. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Oregon.
I really thank my colleague so much for coming down to stand up for the people of his home state and said, secret police don't belong in my state, in my city of Chicago, or anywhere in the United States, and that we should act on this floor to make sure that that is not the case. We must work and fight for the citizens all across this country. It would be the right thing for us to debate my simple amendment that says ID and you stay in the near vicinity of a federal property and you don't engage in these attacks on peaceful protesters. We should debate it. If people disagree with it, they should stand up and explain why. Maybe we could come to a common understanding. You know how rare it is for senators to come down and actually have a dialogue and debate? It just doesn't happen. On something as important as this, shouldn't every member be here weighing in and considering it? Madam President, how much time do I have left?
The junior senator from Oregon has 18 minutes.
18 minutes. I'm going to read another story from a woman who was at the protest 2 nights ago, and her name, Tiffany, she says, "I was there. Let it be known that police fired on peaceful protesters. The feds are here. This is really happening in Portland." Knowing the risks, in the middle of a pandemic, mothers of our city formed a chain to protect peaceful protesters. We stood united with flowers and yellow shirts and peace signs. Thought I'd put up again the picture of this protester with her flowers. Behind the safety of their fence, the police fired upon a small number of us with their, quote, non-lethal bullets. As a symbol, I used my baby's blanket to attempt to shield myself. They therefore knew exactly what they were doing. They heard our peaceful calls and fired anyway. When the fence fell and the mothers continued to protest peacefully from the side, the police threw tear gas at us. We had to scatter into the streets, stumbling, trying to keep our masks on, trying to avoid cars and more gas. When we attempted to regroup, the feds arrived. Some of us, just trying to make our way to our cars, found our way blocked by federal agents in full combat gear. Full combat gear. They too fired gas at unarmed protesters, including myself. I yelled, "You are in violation of the U.S. Constitution. You are in violation of the Bill of Rights. I own my home in Portland, Oregon. I pay my taxes in Portland, Oregon. I have a right to walk on my own street without being assaulted by my government. I have a right to be here." They silenced us with more gas. See the images for yourself. When the government attempts to take your liberty, that is when it is appropriate to risk your life. Nonetheless, you will notice we took every precaution to stop the spread. Every single one of us wore a mask. We had people spraying hand sanitizer from spray bottles. But you know, once you get gassed, very hard not to spread water droplets. Gas makes your nose and eyes pour water like a faucet. Not necessarily non-lethal force when we are in the middle of a pandemic. Madam President, I reserve the balance of my time and yield to my colleague from Connecticut.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I appreciate the senator breaking for a moment to allow me to just say a few words, and I might pose a question to him that if he chooses to answer with the remaining part of his time, I would want to make sure that my remarks are counted towards my time, not Senator Merkley's time.
Correct.
Senator Merkley and I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee together. And what we have watched together over the course of our time on that committee is a reversal of what was called by some scholars the end of history. There was this idea that democracy was going to be triumphant in the world, that in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, that democracy, participatory, open democracies, capitalist economies had effectively won the fight, and that it was just a matter of time before the rest of the world was living in a system like ours that respects the rule of law and allows for those who want to protest their government to do so under the protection of law. And much of our outreach to the Communist Party in China during the 1980s and 1990s came under the presumption that even China would eventually fall under the crushing weight of advancing democracy. We now know that to not be true, because we are at a moment in time in which we hear on the Foreign Relations Committee uninterrupted testimony of countries that we would have, even just a decade ago, accepted and named as a democracy, starting to slide away from the rule of law, away from the protection of speech, into something else. Now, you don't go from a democracy to an autocracy overnight, and so many of the countries that we are concerned about are in that transition, and we hope that an active United States playing a role for democracy promotion in the world can help pull them back. But it is a reminder that democracy in many ways is a very unnatural mechanism to control or run your life or society. I always remind my constituents back home that there aren't many other things in your life that are really important that you run by democratic vote. You don't run your business by democratic vote. Your kid's sports team doesn't run by democratic vote. I love my 8-year-old and 11-year-old, but they don't get an equal vote in the decisions in my household. Democracy is fairly unnatural. We don't really choose it as a mechanism to run other institutions in this country, but we reserve it for government. We reserve it for government. But it only maintains, it only survives, it only perseveres if we tend to it. And we have not been tending to it over the last 3 years. And so I rise to support Senator Merkley and his effort because I have watched what these other governments do at the outset. These would-be autocrats, what they do to try to gently begin to quell people's interest in free speech. And the tactics that are being used in Portland, the tactics that were used just down the street in the nation's capital, the tactics that are being contemplated for other cities throughout this country are reminiscent of tactics that have been proved successful in other countries to try to push people back inside their homes, to try to disincentivize their interest in speaking up against power. Because I'm going to tell you, as word spreads that if you run out to the streets to protest your government, you may be requisitioned and shoved into an unmarked vehicle. If you're a single mom who can't disappear for an hour, never mind a day, you aren't going to be that interested in going out and speaking freely. All of a sudden, if the government is starting to come down like a ton of bricks with federal troops, with sweeps of peaceful protesters off the streets and into confinement, it does start to chill people's interest in standing up. And that is why governments across the world have tried to pioneer these practices. They say they're still democracies. They claim they still observe the rule of law. But then when people try to go out and protest, they throw the military at them. They start to snatch people off the streets. And all of a sudden, people start to think to themselves that they are better off just staying in their homes. They are better off not protesting their government because the consequences now feel too significant. And so I know, Senator Merkley, that a lot of folks claim that we are engaged in hyperbole when we talk about the risks to democracy presented by this administration. But through our collective seats on the Foreign Relations Committee, we see what is happening around the world. We see the ways in which drip by drip an open participatory democracy can all of a sudden start to foreclose the rights of people to be able to petition their government. And we should just remember that over the course of history, It is 0.001% of citizens that have lived in a democracy. This is not actually how the world has chose to organize itself. And we now have these templates. We now have these models provided to us by people like the leader in Turkey or the new president in the Philippines, by which we should be cautioned in the ways in which we start to constrain speech, the ways in which we start to punish speech, the ways in which we start to make people believe that there is so much risk in speaking out against their government that they're better off just accepting whatever comes their way. And so I come to the floor today as someone who introduced legislation requiring the identification of military forces when they are doing crowd control. The minute that I saw those unmarked officers on the streets of the nation's capital, I knew how dangerous it was. And I know enough about the history of our own country to know that vigilante justice masked from identification is reminiscent of some of the worst moments in American history. And so I know that we should be students enough of our own history to understand the danger to democracy presented by unidentified, unaccountable agents of justice. But I also know, as a student of the world today, that there are plenty of examples overseas that should caution us as well. And so maybe there isn't a question in there, Senator Merkley, but I'm just so appreciative of your efforts, so appreciative that you've allowed me and the legislation that I've offered to Senator Schumer to require identification of federal security forces to be added to the bill that you are offering. And I will be with you every step of the way if we are not successful in getting it included in the legislation pending today to make sure it finds a way into law. I think it is a cornerstone. Your legislation is a cornerstone of our strategy to protect democracy for the next 240 years.
Would my colleague from Connecticut yield to a question?
I would.
And for clarification, will my question be credited to my colleague's time? And can I ask unanimous consent that it would be credited to his time?
If the senator for Connecticut yields for a question, it comes off his time.
I would yield for a question then.
Thank you. You made the point about lack of identification, and I have here the picture of how these have been deployed, and I'll make sure you can see it as well. Men in camouflage, the generic police, no sense of what agency they're part of, no unique identifier, even as the head of their organization, because we were later clarified, we found out they were with the CBP, Customs and Border Protection. He said, of course they have unique identifiers, and of course they're marked as federal law enforcement, which they are not. But if one of these individuals, in the course of attacking protesters, shoots them with a rubber bullet that fractures their forehead and puts them in critical condition in the hospital, would we have any idea how to hold that officer accountable if they have no ID?
Thank you for the question. And this is what led me to join with many of my other colleagues, as I mentioned, including Senator Schumer, to introduce the legislation in the wake of the protests in our nation's capital. Accountability is also a cornerstone of the rule of law. The only way that we can aggrieve abuses of power is to know who committed those abuses of power. Now, listen, these troops or these riot officers, they were ordered to be in that space. And let's be honest that the vast majority of these patriotic law enforcement officers are trying to do the right thing. But we know, because we've seen the video, there have been repeated abuses on the streets of Portland, on the streets of New York City, on the streets of the nation's capital. And when those occur, frankly, it should be in the interest of law enforcement leadership themselves to be able to hold those individuals accountable so that we can make sure that the blame is not ascribed to every single individual who is uniformed and on these streets, but that we hold the specific individuals or the individuals who ordered them to take those actions accountable. And so, as a broad question, Americans should want to know what agency these individuals are representing and should at least have a badge number attached to them so that we can make sure that individual actions have a line of accountability. But I would argue that the agencies themselves should want that if they are really in the business of making sure that any abuses of power by their officers or by their soldiers or by their police are held to account as well. Thank you. I yield back at this point.
Mr. President,
The senator for Oregon.
I thank my colleague for Connecticut for his intense effort to defend the civil rights of the citizens, not only of his state, but all Americans, and for the truth he speaks that when you have anonymous officers in war gear attacking peaceful crowds and committing really disturbing acts of violence against them, it is an unacceptable thing in our democracy. And he has noted that there was this conversation about the triumph of democracy as a strategy, and it was going to spread, and where we were going to find ourselves by this time was a world ruled by we the people governments across the land, and how that is not the case. And he mentioned several countries that have been backsliding, and I think we could add to that list places like Poland and Hungary. We have seen, and I believe he mentioned Turkey. It's tempting to be a strong man. And we have heard the President of the United States convey his admiration for these strong men across the planet. But then he starts to bring their secret police fascist tactics to the streets of America, and we have an obligation under our oath of office and simply as citizens of this nation to stand up and say no. I've been reading letters from women who are on the front line down in the peaceful protest, clarifying that there was no violence except the violence of the federal agents against them. Here is another such letter. I am a mom. I am a nurse. I live in Portland. I was peacefully protesting police brutality and racism tonight alongside other moms as part of the protest in downtown Portland. I had my arms linked with my own mom and my close friend when federal agents in camo rushed us with guns pointed. They paused for a split second as if to consider if they were really going to enact violence on a group of unarmed moms. Then they pushed people down to my left. We were chanting, "Don't hurt our kids." They threw flashbangs at our feet. They tear-gassed the crowd. I will not be silent. This is not okay. Don't just consume the line that it's a bunch of anarchists the police and feds are attacking. That is not okay. Black Lives Matter. I have many more letters of people explaining what happened. They all are basically the same. There were some kids doing some graffiti. There were some pounding on the door of the federal courthouse, but there was no violence. The only violence came from the feds attacking the peaceful protesters. Mr. President, I'm going to reserve the balance of my time, and I see my colleague is here from the state of Utah. Mr. President, I yield the floor.